Hey class, I'm coming to you from my quarantine at my house. I am in my home office, and since I had to cancel class and there was some important information that I wanted to provide to you, I decided to make a video. And so we're going to finish up the lecture on Chapter 3, Federalism, and if you'll stay tuned till the end, I'll give you some information on the exam, which will be next week. So be sure and stay tuned. I am feeling okay. I've got a cough. Yesterday I had a fever. It broke this morning. A few aches, but really feel okay. They don't think I'll know the results of my COVID test, which was terrible, by the way, until Friday or Saturday. So let's jump right in and finish up with the exciting topic of federalism. And I would like to point out to you, as you note, that as we go through the chapters in the text, they're laid out in a particular order for a reason. We started off looking at why is government necessary? Why do we need government? Then we looked at the U.S. Constitution, how our system of government was formed. And then we looked at the Missouri Constitution and how under this system of federalism, where you have more than one governmental unit that has power or authority over the citizens, we looked at Missouri state government in its relation to the United States government under the U.S. Constitution. And so that brings us to this chapter, Chapter 3, to go a little bit deeper into this concept of federalism and how these two different levels of government work with one another. And as we talked about in last class on Monday, initially, the way our system of government was formed, there were distinct layers, and the federal government's authority was set out. It was very limited. Most power was left to the states under the Reserve Clause. So the states exercised the bulk of the power over the citizens, while the United States government was more limited. We saw a couple of cases, Supreme Court cases in the early 1800s, McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden, that used Article 1, Section 8, the Elastic Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and the Interstate Commerce Clause to expand the powers of the federal government as it relates to the citizens in the states. Then we talked about the Civil War and how it pushed the issue of state rights back in favor of more authority to the federal government. And then we ended the class by talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal legislation that was a result of the Great Depression, and how the powers of our federal government took another step forward to become the large entity that it is and the powers that it currently has over the citizens. And so tonight we're going to look at this concept of dual federalism and cooperative federalism. So as we initially started out, and let me show you where I'm at on the slideshow if you want to follow along. This is the slide we're on, dual federalism and the New Deal legislation that we talked about last time, and cooperative federalism. And before we get too far, you kind of need to have an understanding of what those concepts mean. Dual federalism just means that each level of government has distinct powers. And so that you have the federal government powers here, and you have the state powers here. And then there's a little section in between where there's concurrent powers that both types of governments have authority. And I will illustrate that. Let me see if I'm not overly technologically advanced, but let me see if I can. I want to show you, if you go to Canvas, and this week we're talking about federalism, and if you slide down, you see the layer cake there. The layer cake is a good pictorial way of understanding dual federalism. You have this upper layer, that would be the authority or powers of the federal government, and then you have this lower layer, which would be the powers of the state governments. And then you have this yummy, delicious, gooey middle layer right there that you see that separates the two layers. Think of that as concurrent powers, the powers that both governments share, like the power to tax and the police power. So that's dual federalism. There's distinct layers, and for the first 100+ years of our nation, we operated under a strict dual federalism type of government. Now, the concept of cooperative federalism means that there's not distinct layers, and actually on any issue that involves the citizenry, both the federal government and the state governments will address an issue. So if you take law enforcement, for example, and we're talking about the fight against illegal narcotics, you have if you have a big bust, you may have federal authorities there, state authorities there, as well authorities at the local level, at the county level or the city level, that is also responding. They're cooperating for the same goal of prosecuting people that are committing drug crimes. You can also look at that in human trafficking and other crimes that may cross state borders. Okay? But you can also look at it in other issues like education. Education was typically just a state issue, but with funding and the needs of local school districts for free and reduced lunches, for curriculum, for salaries, there is money available from the federal government, and so they cooperate in the education of the students of America. And so when we're talking about cooperative federalism, both levels of government, we're talking about the federal level and the state level, they cooperate with one another to address a certain issue that's confronting the citizenry. And so we think, back to our analogy of the layer cake of dual federalism, we can also think of an analogy, staying on the cake theme, of a marble cake to show cooperative federalism. And as you can see in cooperative federalism, there's not distinct layers. They're kind of intermingled with one another. They both share authority over the same type of things. Okay? And let me get back to the slideshow here. So, for example, as we're talking about shifting from that layer cake model and dual federalism more towards a cooperative federalism, your book illustrates child labor. And that child labor was a problem confronting society from the beginning of our country clear up through the early 1900s. Why didn't the federal government simply ban it? Well, that was a power that fell in that lower level of our layer cake, and that was an issue to be addressed by the states. Some states did address it, some states did not. And it wasn't until part of that New Deal legislation that the federal government started addressing some of these issues. And as we ended the class last time talking about President Roosevelt, he was a president in a very pivotal time in our nation's history. The United States was coming off some of its glory days, having been very successful in World War I, and the industrial revolution that was taking place. Henry Ford and the assembly line. We were cranking out things. We're manufacturing. Businesses going booming, and you hit the Roaring '20s. It was just a time of a lot of wealth in the United States. Very little federal regulation. Remember, federal government was very limited, and so it was a good time to be an American. And then you had a series of calamities take place towards the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s. which you had the Dust Bowl, a severe famine and drought hit America's breadbasket, where most of the food and produce came from for America. You had, excuse me, you had, as a result of that, you had Americans starting to fall on hard times. There was a run on banks. The stock market, there was very little regulation of banks and the stock market, and the bottom fell out. So one domino fell, led to another domino, and America was in dire straits, couldn't feed itself, you couldn't make money, there was no work, there was no jobs, people were standing in bread lines, and this is the environment that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was faced with when he came to power. And President Roosevelt was no stranger to difficulties. He suffered polio as a child, was in a wheelchair, had to have leg braces, and then eventually to a wheelchair, and eventually he lost the battle to that in 1945. So he wasn't unaccustomed to difficulties, even though he came from a very wealthy family and in that upper level socioeconomic level of society. So he was also a liberal, progressive Democrat that had some really good ideas about pulling America up by its bootstraps. That was the language that was used at the time. Pull them up by their bootstraps, get Americans fed, get them back to work, and then let's implement some infrastructure so that we don't have these problems in the future. So we saw the development of Social Security, Medicare, some government work jobs through the Tennessee Valley Authority. We saw the first beginnings of the welfare system that we know today, helping impoverished Americans meet their needs. This is an example of the federal government cooperating with state governments, because there were state agencies that also dealt with these issues. They just were not, they were overwhelmed. And so this is the first real big example of the federal government cooperating with state and local governments in addressing the needs of its citizens. And even though it had a sunset clause, so all these programs were to eventually go away after America got pulled up by its bootstraps, it never did. It just kept getting extended and extended. But we're shifting. There's a big shift from dual federalism and that layer cake to cooperative federalism and the marble cake. So how does the federal government, because the Constitution hasn't changed. The Constitution is still the same as it was in 1789 with the 27 amendments. And some of those amendments have been more recent, but they really don't have to do with the government's power as it does the distinctions between federal and state power, as it does with issues like voting, the age of voting, and some other issues. So how does the federal government do it? The power of the purse. The federal government has a lot of resources, and so when it wants the state governments to come into compliance with what they think is best for the citizenry, they offer money, and that money comes in the form of grants, categorical grants. These are grants that are for specific purposes, and if you apply and you meet the requirements, you get the money. Block grants are more general in nature to be used more broadly for specific purposes, and that is a very powerful way for the federal government to have influence over state governments. For example, some of the things that we have talked about, education. Education is strictly a state and local issue from local school boards, which govern the day-to-day activities of a school, to the state government that has regulatory authority over those schools to make sure that they are certified and meeting the obligations and responsibilities to provide an adequate education to the students of the district. So how does the federal government have any influence over that? Through money. So if a school district needs money to help with free and reduced lunches, then it will apply for grants or federal money. A lot of that is Title IX money, and that will help pay for free and reduced lunches. And there's also some other materials and resources available to help school districts. A controversial thing that happened under the Obama administration was Michelle Obama's initiative to make sure that school meals were nutritious, and it also would fight the obesity problem facing many of America's youths. And so there were specific guidelines on what could and could not be included in meals provided to students at school. As a result of this, there was an outcry because the portions that were served were reduced, and the students really didn't like it as well. Would students rather have, a fruit cup and cheese or one of them square pizzas, cardboard pizzas? And so there was kind of some outcry about that. And some school districts, your more wealthy school districts, for example, Camden School District fits in that category, Miss Miller. Waynesville fits into that category currently. Branson fits into that category. And they are districts that are very wealthy from their tax base. Other school districts, Lebanon to a lesser extent, but Jolie Barber, my home district, which is a K-8 district, and the district that I went to school to, and so did Mrs. Miller's mom, it's a very poor district. And so it heavily relies on federal grant money. And so when you take those grants, they come with strings attached. And so that means if you take the money, you've got to follow the directives that is provided to you by the federal government. So in order to get the free and reduced lunch federal money, you're going to have to meet the Michelle Obama guidelines for nutritious lunches. So that's an example of how federal government is able to influence local districts. Another example that I typically use and show my age is when it comes to speed limits. In my lifetime, when I was born up until the late 1970s, 1980, the speed limit was 70 miles per hour. Actually, it was mid to the late 70s. The speed limit on I-44 was 70 miles per hour. Then, towards the end of the 70s, there was an oil shortage. OPEC, the Middle Eastern countries that produce oil, was putting a squeeze on the rest of the world, and oil prices jumped. And my goodness, I remember when gas hit $1 a gallon for the first time. People thought the end was coming. And in the 70s, we had them big, huge cars. And by the end of the 70s, there were little bitty cars that were more economical and got better fuel mileage. The federal government, in an effort to address this crisis, wanted the speed limit reduced from 70 miles an hour to 55. Why? They believed it was safer, but the real reason was it's more economical. If you're driving 55 miles per hour, doesn't matter of your car, you're going to get better gas mileage and use less gas than if you're driving 70 miles an hour. So that was the real reason. But speed limits is strictly a state issue. So if you're looking at that layer cake, it would fall into that bottom layer. That's an issue that is addressed by the states. And so the federal government said, hey, states, if you want your federal highway money to help with your roads and infrastructure, bridges, things of that nature, then you'll lower your speed limit to 55. And so most states in the nation, they didn't like it. They griped about it, but just about every one of them followed along. Montana is an exception, and Montana is a large state geographically, but not a lot of roads, and they didn't feel they really needed all that money from the federal government. So they said, keep your money and we're going to leave our speed limits so you can travel as fast as you would like. And that's okay. That's an important concept for you to understand in this idea of federalism and cooperative federalism. If you get outside of that layer cake where there's distinct powers for the federal government and distinct powers for the state governments, if you want to muddle that and get into cooperative federalism, excuse me, and more into the marble cake type situation, you can't force it. It's a voluntary thing. And it's voluntary in that if you want the money, you will comply. And so, again, most states lowered their speed limit to 55, and it took a long time to get to Springfield, going 55 miles an hour. And then, after that crisis passed, and in the 1990s, it bumped back up from 55 to 70 miles per hour. And I remember teaching this class over a decade ago, and I'm talking about these concepts with my class, and I said, hey, you all remember when speed limits were 55? And they're like, what? Speed limit on I-44 was 55? Are you serious? And I'm like, yeah. Don't you remember the Sammy Hagar song, I Can't Drive 55? And they're like, who? Who's Sammy Hagar? And I'm like, oh, goodness, I am getting old. Sammy Hagar was a rock and roll singer and came out with I Can't Drive 55. You can Google it and watch the video. And then I said, well, Sammy Hagar, he went on to become the lead singer after David Lee Roth with Van Halen. Anybody remember that? Know who Van Halen is? Then people are like, oh, yeah, we know Van Halen. So that's an example of cooperative federalism. Another more recent issue is the alcohol level in a person's blood to be presumed intoxicated for driving while intoxicated purposes. And for a long time, it was 0.10. So if your blood alcohol content was 0.10% of alcohol to blood, then you were presumed to be intoxicated. And so you take the breathalyzer, blue 0.10, and you could get a ticket for driving while intoxicated or arrested. In the 2000s, that new millennia, the federal government, there was still a high rate of fatalities that were driving while intoxicated related. So the federal government decided it wanted to lower the blood alcohol content from 0.10 to 0.08. And for those of you that are old enough and might enjoy an adult beverage, if you smell an alcoholic beverages, do not get behind the wheel. It does not take much to get to a 0.08%. And it was the same issue as it was with the speed limits. States really rebelled about doing that, but if they wanted the federal money for their highways and bridges, then the state legislatures would lower the blood alcohol content to 0.08. And currently, I think every state in the union has lowered its blood alcohol content to 0.08. Again, an example of cooperative federalism. Not all issues are that adverse. Some, like last year, the city of Lebanon bought a new ladder truck, and they bought that ladder truck with a grant from the federal government that to help with the issue of fire safety in our local communities. Those trucks are tremendously expensive and very difficult for local fire districts and cities to purchase. And so they applied for and got a grant to help purchase the fire truck that offset the majority of that purchase price. And those types of block grants, they typically are matching in nature. So the federal government may pay 80% of it, but the local government has to come up with 20%. Or some other type of percentage. It's both investing in it, but there are strings attached. And so when they take that money for that fire truck. That fire truck has to be used for specific purposes. If there's a federal government crisis or emergency where that fire truck is needed, they're going to have to be able to use it. But that's really not a bad thing. That's a good example of where there's true cooperation. It's not the carrot and the stick where if you want this money, you better comply. It is, hey, we've got an issue. How can we best work together to address it? And let's both invest in making this situation a better situation. And so there's many of those grants out there too. But the key is through all this money from the federal government into state and local agencies, we have become more and more of a cooperative federalism than we are dual federalism with those distinct layers. There are still those distinct layers, but now they've become more muddied because the federal and local governments cooperate on more and more issues. And I would say for the most part that is a good thing, that we are able to take advantage of resources at all these different levels to address the needs of the citizens. Without those, you'd see a lot more disparity between the states that have and the states that have not. And so like on issues of fire safety, it's important that all Americans have firefighting equipment to protect its citizens. And without this concept of cooperative federalism, we may not have that. So hopefully you've gained some understanding of cooperative federalism. There are some limits on the national government's power to coerce the states. They can't mandate it and not fund it. It's called an unfunded mandate. So if the federal government says you have to do this, let's say, my example, they're not giving any money for the fire truck, but they say you have to, if you have a firehouse, if you have a fire district, you have to have a truck that meets these requirements. Oh, and we're not going to give you any money to get that truck. It would be an unfunded mandate. They're mandating something and not providing the funds to see it through. So there are limits on what the federal government can do. We are going through some of the slides. We're about to wrap it up. And it poses the question, should the federal government have a role in educational policy? It's still up to the local school districts, but again, if you are going to receive federal aid, you better look really close at what strings are attached. And if it's something you don't think you can live with, then don't accept the money. So there's still that, even though they may not have much of a choice, there is still some of that control at the local level. And if the citizens that live in that school district don't want to have to rely on the federal government and the mandates that come along with those grants, then they need to be willing to raise their taxes to keep the school funded and certified so that they do not have to take the federal money. Some of the recent trends, we've went back a little bit towards state rights, and typically when a conservative movement tends to be more towards state authority versus federal authority. A liberal platform may be more towards the federal government rather than the states. And we've had some control of conservatives in Congress and in the White House. And so some of the recent issues, and the Supreme Court has shifted from a liberal court to a more conservative court, even though it's very close. And so some of the issues like on immigration have been more to let the states have that authority and not the federal government, letting states have more authority in determining who to deport and when. Healthcare reform, Same-sex marriage is a big one. We're going to talk about that issue when we talk about civil liberties. But the initial Supreme Court ruling allowed the states that it's an issue that was not addressed in the U.S. Constitution, and therefore it's something that the states can address. That has since shifted back. Voting Rights Act, affirmative action. Affirmative action we're going to talk about when we talk about civil rights. Just so you know that for purposes of this slide, the Supreme Court also plays an important role in its decisions in this concept of federalism. Because they will rule, federal government, you have the authority to regulate this issue, or federal government, you do not have the authority to regulate this issue. And if the federal government doesn't have that right, then it falls into that bottom layer of the layer cake, and it's a state government issue. Of course, the Supreme Court can also rule that the state government's action is in violation of the U.S. Constitution, and under the Supremacy Clause, it is null and void. But for purposes of federalism, when the Supreme Court rules that the federal government has exceeded its authority, that is an authority that can be pursued by state governments, and so there's a shift when they make those rulings more towards state rights. Okay, I hope everybody's still on board and nobody's sleeping yet. And that concludes the slideshow and the lecture on federalism. Hopefully from the materials that you will find on Canvas. And if you watch the videos and click the links, hopefully you'll have a good grasp and understanding of these concepts of federalism, dual federalism, and cooperative federalism. Of course, if you're still struggling with it, don't hesitate. Excuse me. Don't hesitate to contact me so that I can make sure that you understand them. Now, for what many of you have been waiting for, is we have the exam coming up next week. You'll be able to access it on Sunday. You'll have a week to take the exam. And let me get here to... I'll show you. I'll flip you around. Here's the Canvas. And let me do the student view. So this is what you will see. If you go down to next week's materials, this is the one we just finished up. And I'm not going to be able to do the student view because I haven't published it yet. But if you go to next week's materials, which will be available beginning Sunday, you will see that this is all the normal things like you see each week concerning the, Chapter 4. And by the way, Chapter 4 will not be on your exam. It will be on the next exam. Your exam only covers Chapters 1 through 3 and the Missouri Constitution. Okay? And so if you go down to Exam 1, you can click on it and you can start, and it's worth 100 points. So there's a lot of points. There's 130 points available next week. So what does the exam consist of? The exam is open book, open note. You can't take it with your buddies. Still, you have to take it one-on-one. And every now and then that is a problem because I'll have people that have missed the exact same questions, and that is not a pleasant conversation to have, so just don't do it. Take it on your own. Be organized when you take it. Here's what the exam consists of. It is 40 multiple choice questions. Okay, there are 10 questions over each unit. So Chapter 1, there's 10 questions. Chapter 2, there's 10 questions. Chapter 3, there's 10 questions. Chapter 4, or Missouri Constitution, there are 10 questions. Okay, so 40 questions, they're worth 2 points apiece, and those are multiple choice. I will also tell you that the first 10 questions on the exam are Chapter 1. The next 10 are Chapter 2. next 10, Chapter 3, and then the final 10 are over the Missouri Constitution. Then you will have 20 matching questions. Okay, so you'll be provided, it's kind of like your quiz. Well, it's exactly like your quiz. You'll be provided with a key term or the definition, and you click and you'll have a drop down and you pick match it with the proper word. And there are 20 of those, so there's 5 from each section. Okay, now I'm going to sweeten the pot just a little bit, because if you go to, before you take the exam, if you go up to resources, study resources on Canvas, and you go down, look there. There is a word bank for exam 1. Students in past classes had complained that when they're doing the matching, there are so many key terms that it's very difficult to pick out the ones. And so I'm going to provide you a word bank. So you will have that, print it off, have it with you whenever you're doing the matching, and it should help. Another thing I want you to know is the exam, you're given 90 minutes to take it. Now this is important. Once you start the exam, you must finish it. Okay, so if you start it and you log off or kicked off, it's going to submit whatever you have completed and you will not be able to take it again. Okay, that can be a real problem. So make sure that when you sit down to take the exam, you have good internet connection, you have no distractions, and you can spend 90 minutes taking that exam. Okay, at the end of 90 minutes, you're going to be kicked off and you're not going to be able to take it again. Okay, so be organized, have your notes and materials organized so that you can find the material fairly quickly while you're taking the exam, and you will not have any problem on this exam. If you have a storm hits and the power goes out and you get kicked off the internet and it submits your exam, don't freak out. It does happen from time to time. From time to time, there will be a glitch with the internet and it will go off. If that happens to you, again, don't freak out. Just contact me and I'll reset it so that you can take the exam again. But that's only in those situations where, through no fault of your own, you were kicked off the internet. Okay? So that's going to complete this unit on federalism and also give you some insight on what to expect on the exam. I hope that my COVID test comes back negative and I will be in class with you on Monday. If it does not, and I am quarantined for the next 2 weeks, then I will be in touch with you and I'll see about either doing a Zoom or I may publish another lecture in this format. Hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your week. Do the online assignments. Stay up. You guys have been awesome. I've been bragging about you, how well you've done. And when this COVID testing and this quarantine, I told the dean that, hey, this is a great class, great students, and I really don't want to miss my time with them. So take care of the online assignments and make sure to be prepared for that exam next week. You'll have all week to take it. Just find 90 minutes that you can take it uninterrupted. So with that said, have a great rest of your day.